All right, time to dive deep. Today, we're ditching the wetsuits and grabbing our digital tool belts. We're going deep into the world of front-end architecture.
Yeah, front-end architecture, it's not always the most glamorous topic, but it's the foundation of everything we do online.
It's like the unsung hero, right? Like,
Right.
we're about to uncover the secrets behind those sleek websites and web apps we use every day.
Exactly. And we've got the perfect blueprint to guide us, Front-End Architecture for Design Systems by Micah Godbolt.
You've got a ton of notes, and I'm excited to dig in and see what architectural gems we can uncover.
Me too. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how Micah approaches this topic.
Well, let's get started then. Micah kicks things off by taking us on a little trip down memory lane, exploring how the web has evolved over the years.
From those early days of simple web pages to the complex web applications we have today.
It's amazing how far we've come. Like back then, you had these webmasters who could handle it all, the design, the coding, everything.
Yeah, it was like a one-person show.
But as the web grew, things got more specialized. You had content strategists, UX designers, front-end developers, all these different roles emerging.
Right. And, while specialization was necessary, it also created a bit of a gap.
A gap. How so?
Well, front-end development, I feel like it often gets treated as an afterthought. Like it's just about making things look pretty.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like
Right.
the focus is on the visual design and the underlying architecture gets neglected.
Exactly. And that's where this whole idea of front-end architecture comes in.
Like having a solid foundation for your website or web app.
Precisely. Just like a building needs a well-thought-out plan, a website's front-end needs architecture.
And that's where the front-end architect steps in.
Yep. They're not just writing code, they're designing the entire system, ensuring that it's efficient, maintainable, and can scale as the project grows.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's like they're laying the groundwork for everything that comes after.
Right. And it's a continuous process. Just like a building might need renovations or additions over time, a website's front end needs to evolve as well.
It's about constantly learning and adapting.
Right. Absolutely. Technology changes so fast, so a good front end architect needs to be able to stay current.
It's not about mastering one specific tool or framework. It's about understanding the principles and approaches that allow you to adapt to new things as they come along.
I completely agree. Now, in Chapter 1, The Discipline of Front-End Architecture, Micah Godbolt lays out these 4 pillars, almost like a foundation, for building a strong front end.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are these 4 pillars?
So there's code, process, testing, and documentation. And what's really interesting is how interconnected they all are.
Like you can't really master one without considering the others, right?
Right. Let's start with code. Chapter 2 dives into this idea that we need to be really intentional about how we write code, how our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript all work together.
So it's not just about getting the job done. It's about doing it in a way that makes sense, is efficient, and is maintainable in the long run.
Exactly. Micah emphasizes that the developer is the primary user of the front-end architecture. It's about empowering them to write the best possible code.
It's like giving them the best tools and a clear roadmap so they can build those amazing websites and web apps.
Absolutely. Now, the second pillar, process, Chapter 3, that's all about creating a smooth workflow, like a well-oiled machine.
Taking that code from the developer's brain to the user's screen seamlessly.
Yeah, no more FTP nightmares.
Definitely not.
Huh?
This is where all those automation tools come in. Version control, task runners, continuous integration.
All those things that help streamline the development process and make sure that the code is high quality.
It's about minimizing errors and making the whole process more efficient.
Now, Chapter 4 tackles something we've all probably encountered at some point in our web development journeys, HTML. Remember the bad old days of div-sum?
Oh yeah, those nested nightmares.
But the book makes a really important point. It's about striking that balance between automation and control. We don't have to hand code every single element, but we need to create a system that's flexible and maintainable.
And one of the tools in our arsenal is utility classes, right?
Right. Those are like having a toolbox full of pre-built styles that you can mix and match.
It's like building with Legos. You have all these different pieces and you can combine them in countless ways to create something unique.
And that promotes reusability and consistency, which are key for building and maintaining a design system.
Okay, let's move on to CSS Chapter 5. I know that CSS is always evolving. Are there any key takeaways from this chapter that will help us stay ahead of the curve?
Absolutely. Micah talks about their own journey with CSS and how important it is to stay current with trends. The chapter dives into some key principles for maintainable CSS, including SMACSS,
SMACSS. That sounds intimidating.
It might sound complex, but really it's just about separating your styles into different categories, like base styles, layout styles, state styles, and theme styles.
So it's like organizing your CSS closet. Everything has its place, and it's easy to find what you need.
Exactly. That makes your CSS much easier to understand, maintain, and update.
And speaking of organization, I remember reading about BEM. Is that covered in this chapter as well?
Yes, BEM block element modifier. It's a naming convention that helps create more organized and reusable CSS classes. Think of it like labeling all your tools in your workshop.
I love that analogy. It makes so much sense.
And then there's the single responsibility principle.
What's that about?
Well, it basically means making sure each CSS selector has only one job to do. No multitasking selectors that try to control too many things.
Keep it focused and organized.
Exactly. And that brings us to JavaScript in Chapter 6. Micah is surprisingly honest about frameworks, saying that there's no perfect one. It really depends on your project's needs.
Which can be overwhelming, right? There are so many choices out there.
Totally. So Micah encourages us to start simple, don't just jump on the latest bandwagon, evaluate what you need, and choose tools that actually address those needs.
It's about finding the right tool for the job, not just the most popular one.
Exactly. Now, even if you're not building complex web apps, this chapter has some great advice on writing clean, maintainable JavaScript code. It's about creating reusable functions, embracing modularity, and avoiding those massive, unwieldy JavaScript files that become a nightmare to manage.
Keep it lean and mean.
Exactly. One key takeaway is avoiding dependency bloat, which is basically not going overboard with adding too many libraries and frameworks.
Makes sense. Each dependency adds more weight and complexity, which can impact your website's performance.
Now, Chapter 7 gets really interesting. We're diving into the world of pattern libraries.
Ah, those collections of reusable design components that are so important for building design systems.
Right. And Micah shares a funny anecdote about being asked if their design was modular and realizing that it wasn't. It's a great reminder that just because your website looks consistent doesn't mean the underlying code is.
It's like having a house that looks great from the outside but has a jumbled mess of wiring and plumbing behind the walls.
And that's where the Roadrunner rules come in.
Roadrunner rules. What are those?
They're like guidelines for creating truly modular components. Imagine them as building codes for your design system.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some of these Roadrunner rules?
Well, one of the key rules is don't use and abuse the cascade.
Don't abuse the cascade. Interesting. Tell me more.
It's about creating self-contained components that don't rely on the cascading nature of CSS to work properly. Each component should be able to stand on its own, like a mini website within your website.
That makes sense. Keeps things organized and prevents unexpected style conflicts.
Right. And another rule is the single source of truth.
Single source of truth. That sounds intriguing.
So it means making sure that each component styles are defined in only one place, which avoids conflicts and confusion. It's like having a single blueprint for each component so that everyone knows exactly how it should look and function.
It's about clarity and consistency, right?
Exactly. Now, Chapter 8 says goodbye to the old way of doing things, like matching markup to static PSD files.
Yeah, that back and forth between designers and developers could be a real pain.
It's about moving towards a more iterative and collaborative approach, where prototypes are tested and refined before being translated into code.
So designers and developers are working together more closely?
Exactly. It's about communication, early feedback, and ensuring that the front end isn't treated as an afterthought.
So it's not just designers throwing designs over the wall to developers anymore.
Exactly. And this chapter talks about the importance of writing effective user stories. Micah argues that we need to shift from page-centric stories to component-centric stories.
So instead of saying update the About Us page, it's more like create a new variation of the call to action button with 16 pixels of padding.
Exactly. It's about thinking in terms of those building blocks, those components that can be used across the entire website.
And that brings us to Chapter 9, which introduces us to task runners.
Oh yeah, task runners are like those little personal assistants that handle all those repetitive tasks in our front-end workflow.
Like what kind of tasks?
Well, things like compiling SASS, concatenating JavaScript files, optimizing images, even deploying code. It's like having a little robot army doing all the tedious stuff for you.
I like the sound of that. It frees us up to focus on the more creative and strategic aspects of front-end architecture.
Absolutely. And with all the plugins available for task runners like Grunt and Gulp, the possibilities for automation are endless.
But choosing between Grunt and Gulp can be a bit daunting, right?
Yeah, there are definitely pros and cons to each, and it really comes down to your project's specific needs and your coding style.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Right. But the key takeaway is that a task runner is a powerful tool in any front-end architect's arsenal.
Okay, Chapter 10 seems to switch gears a bit. It takes us behind the scenes at Red Hat, showing us how their front-end team works.
Yeah, it's like peeking into a well-oiled front-end development machine. What's really interesting is how they emphasize working several sprints ahead of the back-end development team.
So the front end isn't just reacting to what the back end is doing, it's proactively shaping the user experience.
Exactly. It allows them to really flesh out designs and interactions before they're implemented on the back end.
It's like having a dedicated design and prototyping phase specifically for the front end, which makes a lot of sense.
Right. And a key part of their process is creating a standard set of deliverables for every component.
Like a blueprint that outlines everything from the design to the underlying code to the documentation.
Exactly. It's all about consistency and making it easier for developers to understand and maintain the components.
They're also big fans of JSON schemas, right?
Yes. Micah describes them as the heart of our system.
Now, I know JSON schemas can sound a bit technical, but how would you explain them to someone who's not familiar with them?
Think of them like a recipe for your data. They define what information goes where, ensuring that everything is structured correctly.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about making sure that all the pieces fit together properly.
And Red Hat takes this even further, using schemas not just for data validation, but also for generating user interfaces and documentation.
So it's like having a single source of truth that drives the entire front-end architecture.
Exactly. They can automatically generate forms for content editors, ensuring that the data entered conforms to the design system.
That's really impressive. And with that, we've reached the end of the first part of the book. We've gone from understanding the evolution of front-end architecture to exploring those 4 key pillars and diving into the specifics of code, process, and some really cool workflow examples from Red Hat.
It's been quite a journey so far, but there's so much more to uncover. I'm excited to see what else Micah Godbolt has in store for us.
Same here. We'll be back soon to explore the rest of this architectural masterpiece. All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We're continuing our architectural journey with front-end architecture for design systems. Yeah, we've laid some serious groundwork understanding what front-end architecture is all about and why it matters.
Now it's time to roll up our sleeves and get into the nitty-gritty details. You got it. We left off talking about Red Hat's incredible workflow, remember?
Yeah, their whole sprints ahead approach was super impressive.
Totally. And now we're jumping into part 4 of the book, where Micah really emphasizes testing.
Okay, testing, 1, 2, 3. What's Micah's take on this?
Well, they make a really powerful statement right off the bat saying, the purpose of any testing is to protect users from a degraded or broken experience.
Makes sense. We all hate those websites down messages, right?
Exactly. And with front-end architecture, testing is even more important because even tiny code changes can have a huge impact on the entire system.
Like a domino effect.
Exactly. So Chapter 11 dives into unit testing, which is all about breaking down your code into its smallest parts, those little functions and modules.
Okay, so like testing the individual ingredients in a cake before baking the whole thing.
Perfect analogy. The idea is to make sure each piece works perfectly on its own before you put it all together.
Makes sense. And then there's this idea of test-driven development, right?
Yeah, TDD. It might seem a little backward at first, but the idea is to write your tests before you even write the code.
So you're basically defining what you want your code to do before you actually write it.
Exactly. And this helps you make sure your code is testable from the very beginning.
It's like setting the ground rules for your code, making sure everything's in order.
Now, Micah also introduces QNet in this chapter, which is a JavaScript testing framework.
Okay, so it's like a tool that helps you write and run those tests more efficiently.
Right. Think of it like a little robot inspector, making sure every line of your code is up to snuff.
Love it. So what's the key takeaway here about unit testing?
Micah stresses that it's not about achieving 100% coverage right away, testing every single line of code.
It's about progress, not perfection.
Exactly. You start with the most important parts and gradually build up your test suite over time.
Okay, that makes sense. So what's next on our testing agenda?
Well, Chapter 12 dives into performance testing, and you know how much users love a fast website?
Oh, absolutely. Nobody wants to wait around for ages for a page to load.
Exactly. So Micah emphasizes the importance of setting a performance budget.
Wait, a budget for performance. Tell me more about that.
It's like a financial budget, but instead of money, you're working with page weight, load times, all those things that impact how fast your site feels.
Okay, so it's about setting limits, making conscious choices to keep your website lean and mean.
You got it. And there are different ways to figure out what those limits should be.
Like looking at your competitors, seeing what industry standards are.
Exactly. It's like doing market research, but for performance.
I love that. So once you've got your budget set, how do you actually stick to it?
Micah introduces a tool called Grunt Perf Budget, which automatically checks your website against your budget and lets you know if you're going overboard.
It's like having a little financial advisor for your website, making sure you're staying within your spending limits.
Exactly. Now, Chapter 13 takes on visual regression testing. This is all about making sure your website looks the way it's supposed to, even after code changes.
Oh yeah, we've all seen those before and after images where a tiny code change breaks the whole layout.
Totally. It's the classic, it worked yesterday, what happened scenario.
And visual regression testing comes to the rescue.
You got it. It automatically compares screenshots of your website to catch any visual changes that might have slipped through the cracks.
So it's like having a time machine for your website. You can see exactly what changed over time.
Exactly. And Micah explores different approaches to visual regression testing, from simple tools to more sophisticated systems.
Are there any specific tools they recommend?
One that stands out is Phantom CSS. It's like having a robotic QA tester who can spot even the tiniest visual discrepancies.
So it's like those spot the difference games, but for websites.
Precisely. And in Chapter 14, we see how Red Hat uses visual regression testing in their workflow.
Okay, so they're putting these concepts into action. Tell me more.
They've customized Phantom CSS to work with their build system.
So they've made it their own.
Yeah. And their approach is all about testing individual components, which gives them really specific feedback and reduces those annoying false positives.
It's like they've fine-tuned their testing process to be super efficient.
Exactly. And that brings us to the fourth and final pillar of front-end architecture documentation. Chapter 15 focuses on style guides, which are like encyclopedias for your design system.
Okay, so they contain all those design patterns, code snippets, and usage guidelines.
Exactly. And Micah explores different tools for generating style guides, like Hologram and SASSdoc.
So Hologram is more of a general-purpose tool, while SASSdoc is specific to SASS, which is a CSS preprocessor.
You got it. Micah talks about how Red Hat started with Hologram but quickly realized they needed something more powerful, which is where Pattern Lab comes in.
Okay, Pattern Lab. Tell me more about that.
It's a tool that takes a component-driven approach. You create, test, and document your design patterns in isolation. It's like giving each component its own little workspace.
So it's like breaking down the design system into bite-sized pieces, making it easier to manage.
Exactly. And Pattern Lab follows those atomic design principles you might have heard of, atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and pages.
Oh, yeah. I remember that. It's like breaking down your design into those fundamental building blocks.
Right. And the cool thing is Pattern Lab doesn't just generate static HTML. It creates this living style guide that you can browse and interact with.
So it's more than just documentation. It's an interactive tool that lets you really see the design system in action.
Exactly. Now, Chapter 17 brings us back to Red Hat. Remember how they were using those JSON schemas?
Yeah, those are pretty cool.
Well, they've combined JSON schemas with this component-driven approach of Pattern Lab to create a truly integrated design system.
So they've taken all these different concepts and tools and woven them together.
They started with the static style guide, then moved to a more dynamic system using Twig templates, and now they're using schemas to define data structures and drive the entire front-end architecture.
It's like they've leveled up their design system to a whole new dimension.
And you know what? That wraps up part 4 of the book. We've explored testing in depth, learned about style guides, and seen how Red Hat uses tools like Pattern Lab and JSON schemas to create something truly remarkable.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, but there's still more to uncover. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're in the final stretch of our exploration of front-end architecture for design systems. And things are about to get really interesting.
Yeah, we've covered a ton of ground already, from the history of front-end architecture to testing and documentation.
But now we're diving into some crucial topics that often get overlooked, like accessibility and performance optimization.
Right. Those are the things that really make or break a website.
So Chapter 18 jumps right into accessibility. What's Micah's take on this?
Well, they make it clear that accessibility isn't just a nice to have, it's essential.
It's about making the web inclusive for everyone, regardless of their abilities.
Exactly. And Micah points out that a lot of accessibility best practices actually align with good front-end architecture principles.
So you're not just making your website more inclusive, you're also making your code more maintainable and SEO friendly.
Right? It's a win-win. The chapter also offers some practical tips for incorporating accessibility into your workflow.
Like using tools to evaluate your website's accessibility and conducting user testing with people with disabilities.
Exactly. And Micah tackles that misconception that accessibility is expensive or time-consuming.
Which it's really not, if you plan for it from the beginning.
They argue that addressing it up front actually saves you time and money in the long run.
Okay, makes sense. So Chapter 19 dives into performance budgets.
Yeah, this is all about setting clear goals for your website's performance.
We talked a bit about performance budgets in the testing section, but it seems like there's a lot more to it than just page weight and load times.
Right. Micah goes deeper into the user experience, how people actually perceive performance.
So it's not just about making your website technically fast, it's about making it feel fast to the user.
Exactly. And one key concept they introduce is the rail model.
Rail, what's that all about?
It stands for response, animation, idle, and load. It's a way of thinking about performance from the user's perspective.
So you're considering how quickly your website reacts to interactions, how smooth the animations are, how efficiently it utilizes idle time.
Precisely. The chapter provides tons of tips for optimizing each aspect of the rail model.
It's about creating a website that feels responsive and delightful to use.
And Micah reminds us that performance optimization is an ongoing process. You're never really done.
It's like a garden, you always have to tend to it.
All right, chapter 20 is all about error handling, which is something we often don't think about until something goes wrong.
It's like that saying, hope for the best, prepare for the worst.
Exactly. Micah stresses that we need to have a plan for dealing with errors gracefully.
No more cryptic error messages that leave users scratching their heads.
Right. It's about creating clear, informative messages that guide users and maintain their trust.
So even when something breaks, you can still provide a positive user experience.
Exactly. And technically, Micah advocates for using tools like error tracking software.
So you can learn from your mistakes and make your front-end architecture more resilient.
Exactly. Now, Chapter 21 is all about analytics.
Ah, the data that tells us how users are interacting with our websites.
Right, but Micah emphasizes that analytics isn't just about collecting data, it's about using that data to make informed decisions.
So it's about turning data into insights that can help us improve the user experience.
Precisely. Micah encourages us to think about which metrics really matter for our project.
Like if you're trying to increase user engagement, you might track things like time on page, scroll depth, or how often users interact with certain elements.
Exactly. And by analyzing that data, you can see what's working and what's not.
And make changes to your front-end architecture to improve those metrics.
Right. Now, Chapter 22 zooms out a bit, looking at the bigger picture of how front-end architecture fits within a design system.
It's like seeing how all the pieces of the puzzle come together.
Micah makes it clear that a design system is more than just visual style.
It's about consistency, a shared language, principles that guide the entire design and development process.
Exactly. And front-end architecture plays a crucial role in bringing that design system to life in the digital world.
It's the bridge between design and code.
Right. And they highlight the importance of collaboration between designers and developers.
Working together to create a cohesive and consistent user experience.
Now, Chapter 23 gets into the technical side of building a front-end architecture for a design system.
Choosing the right tools and technologies, that's always a challenge.
Micah reminds us that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
You have to choose the tools and frameworks that best suit your project's needs and your team's skills.
Right. And they explore different options, from JavaScript frameworks like React and Vue.js to CSS frameworks and more.
The key is to evaluate the pros and cons of each approach and find the right balance for your project.
And Micah emphasizes the importance of staying current. The front-end landscape is always changing.
It's about being adaptable and open to new ideas.
All right, Chapter 24 tackles the challenge of scalability.
Building a front-end architecture that can grow and evolve as your website or application expands.
Micah highlights the importance of modularity. breaking down your front end into those reusable components we talked about earlier.
Right, it's like building with Legos. You have all these different pieces that you can assemble and reassemble in different ways.
Exactly. And that makes your code more organized and easier to maintain.
And speaking of maintainability, they also talk about the importance of clear naming conventions and coding standards.
It's about creating a system that everyone on the team can understand and work with.
So it's not just about writing code that works. It's about writing code that other developers can easily read and understand.
Precisely. Chapter 25 revisits performance optimization, focusing on creating that fast and smooth user experience we talked about earlier.
So it's like a deeper dive into those performance principles.
Micah really emphasizes that performance isn't just about speed. It's about creating an experience that feels responsive and enjoyable for the user.
It's about making sure your website doesn't feel clunky or slow.
Exactly. And they cover a wide range of optimization techniques, from minimizing file sizes to optimizing images and fonts.
It's about squeezing every bit of performance out of your front-end architecture.
Right. Now, Chapter 26 focuses on testing, which is essential for making sure your website is reliable and free of bugs.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Micah reminds us that testing isn't just about catching errors, it's about building confidence in your code.
It's about knowing that your website is going to work as expected no matter what.
Exactly. They cover different testing methodologies, from unit testing individual components to integration testing, how different parts work together.
And they also talk about different types of testing, like functional testing, performance testing, accessibility testing, and visual regression testing, which we've already discussed.
Micah encourages us to automate as much of our testing as possible.
Using tools to make the process faster and more efficient.
Exactly. Now, Chapter 27 takes a step back and looks at front-end architecture's role in the broader software development process.
So it's about seeing how front-end architecture fits into the bigger picture.
Right. Micah emphasizes that it's not an isolated discipline.
It's part of a larger ecosystem.
Exactly. It needs to be integrated with back-end development, design, product management, all those different aspects of building a website.
So it's about collaboration, communication, and breaking down those silos between teams.
Chapter 28 is all about documentation, which is something that often gets neglected, but it's so important.
Documentation, yeah, it's not always the most glamorous part of the process, but it's crucial for a successful project.
Micah emphasizes that good documentation isn't just about writing comprehensive guides, it's about creating a culture of knowledge sharing.
So it's about making sure everyone on the team has access to the information they need and can contribute to the project's success.
Exactly. Now, Chapter 29 takes a look at the future of front-end architecture.
Always exciting to think about where things are headed. What trends does Micah see on the horizon?
Well, they highlight the increasing complexity of the web, the rise of new technologies, and the demand for better performance and accessibility.
It's like the web is constantly evolving, and we have to evolve with it.
They talk about things like the evolution of JavaScript frameworks, the importance of component-based development, the need for scalable architectures, and the growing importance of design systems.
It's a lot to keep up with.
Micah encourages us to be curious, keep learning, and embrace the ever-changing nature of front-end development.
So it's a continuous journey of learning and growth.
Exactly. And finally, Chapter 30 brings us to the conclusion of the book.
So it's time for Micah to share some parting wisdom.
They reflect on their own journey as a front-end architect and offer advice for anyone who's passionate about this field.
Okay, what are some of the key takeaways?
Well, they emphasize the importance of continuous learning, challenging assumptions, and adapting to change.
It's like they're saying, don't be afraid to experiment and try new things.
Exactly. They encourage us to share our knowledge, contribute to the open source community, and advocate for best practices.
It's about making the web a better place for everyone.
And they remind us that front-end architecture is about people, collaboration, and building something that's useful and enjoyable for users.
Micah leaves us with a call to action, right?
Yeah, they challenge us to embrace the challenges of front-end architecture, to be lifelong learners, and to strive to build a better web.
Well, there you have it, folks. We've reached the end of our deep dive into front-end architecture for design systems. I hope you've enjoyed this journey as much as we have.
Me too. It's been a whirlwind of information, from the fundamental principles to the future of the web.
Micah has given us a comprehensive and insightful guide to this complex and ever-evolving field. And I think we're all walking away with a much deeper understanding of what it takes to build truly great websites and web applications.
I completely agree. Now, it's your turn. What stood out to you from our deep dive? What are you excited to explore further or implement in your own projects?
Until next time, happy architecting.